after really, frankly, years of hoping that one day I'd have a cabin in the woods, I decided it was time to get serious. And, you know, folks, I tend to research things for a fairly long period of time, sometimes as much as a year or more. In the case of building a cabin, I had spent probably a good year already looking at real estate. My first mission was to try to find a piece of property that frankly didn't cost a lot of money because we weren't wealthy. So, you know, how does a regular working Joe go out there and put together enough money to buy a cabin? I decided that around $20,000 would be a reasonable cost. I could probably swing that. And I found a website of the craziest names. It was Dirt Cheap Dirt. And I thought, well, maybe that's a place to look. And I started looking, and lo and behold, I found quite a few pieces of property that were in the 20-acre footprint, which is what I was really looking for, and about $20,000, though commonly in the $25,000 range. But you always figure you might be able to talk them down a little bit. So Darci and I set off to go explore these places, and they were quite far from where we are in the grand scheme of things. I was pretty young, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but it's certainly something that if you're looking for property, you're thinking of building a cabin in the woods, you might try to find something within a couple hours. Whatever your limit is for driving that you think is going to be acceptable. For me at the time, I didn't mind driving, frankly, and I could drive all over. 8 or 10 hours didn't bother me. So finding a place 4 to 5 hours away, while a little bit far, it wasn't a deal breaker for me. But we got up there, we started looking around, and frankly what we found was these properties were steep, they were practically uninhabitable, they had no water, or they had an existing structure that in one case was a cob structure or a hay bale structure. While yes, that's a great way to insulate if that's what you have to do, it really just invites pests. You know, the rats and the mice love it. And the particular place that we found, it was terrible. Whoever built that hay bale house actually put an outhouse inside of the house. Oh my gosh, that's insane. No, thank you. We had just about given up, but there was another piece that was about an hour away from the last. I thought, why don't we take a look at this piece because it looked really nice. And I just kind of wanted to see what the difference was from a $25,000 listed property to a $50,000 listed property, essentially, right? Well, we got to the property and immediately fell in love. It was gorgeous. We loved it. I mean, we happened to show up at that time that if you're going to be there, it's the prime time to be there. It was early June, either late May or early June, but I think it was around Father's Day in June. And it was gorgeous. It was almost park-like. It had one little structure, a little shed that wasn't very well built, but it was a shed. You could put things in. And it had an old 10 or 12 foot camper on it that had some mice living in some of the compartments, and it wasn't too terribly bad, but it looked like it might have had some leaks. And it had a well and a cistern, and it also had a spigot down near the camper, but it also had a seasonal stream. So we're talking dream property, right? Honestly, beautiful place. So we went home, crunched all the numbers, and figured out that the money that we had set aside that we could use to buy a piece of property would be about half of the total cost. So we looked at some options, did a little fancy footwork, and came up with the rest of the money so that we could buy the property without taking out a loan, which I believe, unless you've got a really low mortgage and a really solid job, I personally don't like the idea of taking a loan out on a piece of recreational property. So you could do it if your intent is to eventually live there. But at the time, we looked at the property really frankly as kind of our little escape, our little getaway, our little slice of heaven we could go and escape to on the weekends or on vacation. So we bought the property. We actually got it for, I think it was like $42,500 or something like that. So not quite as bad as the $49,900. We went and got the keys to the camper and the shed, kind of checked everything out, saw that there was water, and went home. Well now, how does a busted up old jarhead, who wasn't that old then, and I wasn't quite as busted up as I am today, that last 15 years has definitely taken its toll, but I still had my physical limitations. I was out of shape, and you really need to be in better shape to build a cabin, quite frankly. It had been, I don't know, 15 years since I'd really framed anything of substance. I just had this desire to build a cabin, but we had actually spent pretty much all the free money we had buying the property. Now, Darci at the time, her thought was, we'll just camp there. And I didn't disagree with that. We liked having our own place to go camping, but in the back of my mind, I wanted a cabin. And Darci did too. She's just more cautious and likes to plan things out longer. Me, I'm going to jump in with both feet as soon as I can. And guess what? That's what I did. As I've mentioned in a previous video, I was a dart player. I had a popular dart website, and I was getting paid advertising money on that website. And it wasn't a lot, but I got a check in for a year's worth of advertising, which would almost cover the framing of the cabin. I would soon learn my estimates were off, and it would cover probably closer to a third, but it was a good start. And what I'm about to tell you now is what it takes to build a cabin in the woods, particularly one that's 4 or 5 hours away from where you live, and what you really need to have in order to do that. So if you're thinking about building a cabin in the woods, this video is for you. All right, so the first thing I want to say is you've got to be at least in reasonably good shape. If you are not in good shape, then I would suggest that before you attempt to take on building a cabin, you get out and walk. And I'm not going to provide fitness advice for people or anything else, but I will tell you that I did at one time get up to 287 pounds. That was the winter of 2012. So I'd already been working on the cabin for 3 years. And prior to that, when I started working on the cabin, I think I weighed around 250, 260, right in that range. And a job that I took on after a brief layoff period was just one that I traveled a lot and ate all the wrong foods and gained a lot of weight. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is you really need to look at your physical fitness. Building a cabin is physical, and if you're going to do it yourself, then you need to take that into account. You might be out of shape and think I'll get in shape building the cabin, but that can present challenges that could become injuries later. So my advice is, if you're out of shape, get out there and walk. At the very least, walk. When I'm up to it, when my back isn't bad, and I have a bad back, so I can't always do it, but when I'm up to it, I try to walk over 4 miles a day. This year, despite some major back trouble, I managed to walk about 300 miles so far. Haven't walked in the last 2 or 3 weeks because if you've watched my channel, you know I slipped a disc, actually 2, and I was barely able to walk, much less get out and walk 4 miles. I'm just slowly getting over that now thanks to some intervention, a couple shots. So physical fitness, that's a big one. Financial fitness is another one. If you're wanting to build a cabin in the woods and you don't really have the ability to finance the build, but you want to build it, well then you got to ask yourself, how do I? I will tell you what my first year's budget was for my cabin, but before I do, I want to talk about the things I did for about 3 years prior to building the cabin. In those 3 years, I started really earnestly looking at the economy and economic data and where we were going as a country. Inflation is a lot higher than you hear on television. And an example of that is the price of gold. When I was starting to really buckle down and try to put my finances in better shape and invest in things and pay things off and all that kind of stuff, I looked at the price of gold and it was under $800 an ounce. I think silver was about 10 bucks an ounce. Well, today, gold is over 2,560. Last I saw it was like 2,560 something. That's almost 4 times what it was just over around 15 years ago. Silver is 3 times what it was. So inflation's an issue. I could see that there was too much spending federally and that our debt was too high and it would cause problems in the future. So what I did is I said, that's it. We're cutting cable, get rid of the landline phones, quit buying bottled water, quit going out to dinner. We're not going to go to the movies except for maybe once in a blue moon. We're not even going to rent movies. We'll use internet TV. This might seem overboard to anybody but, say, a prepper, but the reality is I looked at every possibility. I began to check things in the store, and I noticed that sliced cheddar cheese, which is my favorite thing to put on a sandwich, was twice as expensive if I bought it sliced than if I bought it at Costco in a 3-pound block. And we went to places like Cash and Carry, or the chef store they call them today, where it's the restaurant store, where we could buy pork butt at a half to a third or a quarter of the price of some other pork products. So looking at those things, I said, okay, let's get a meat slicer, cheese slicer, and a vacuum sealer, and let's just slice our own cheese. Let's get a meat grinder and make our own pork sausage or hamburger or whatever it was we wanted. And believe it or not, those things paid off in spades. Yeah, that's kind of what the preppers do. Nothing wrong with that. Frankly, I believe being prepared is a good idea. I'm an old Marine. What do you expect, right? But we even went further than that. I started hunting again. We made our own jerky. We made our own venison burger. We did all kinds of things to save money. What that amounts to is that we were able to budget $1,000 a month for that first year on our building project. Now, if you're looking at me now thinking, well, there's no way I can budget $1,000 a month, then I would tell you, then you have to very, very seriously look at building a cabin and whether you can afford it, because it's not really that cheap. Even if prices were the same today as they were 15 years ago, and they're not, when you look at the cost of everything, of framing, the pier blocks, because I did a post and pier foundation, all the framing, all the windows, all the doors, even if you went and got most of it at places like the restores, Goodwills and that kind of thing, it's still going to cost you a lot of money. Now, I did save money because I was in the mindset of saving money, and just a year and a bit into building the cabin, I bought a very, very small sawmill, the Wood-Mizer LT10, and I started making my own lumber too. In the beginning, all I was really trying to do was make paneling like this for the interior. And I found that I could save enough money that my savings actually paid for the sawmill. And later I even put the sawmill on a trailer and did a bunch of work with it, and then I sold it for what I had in it. And I bought a bigger sawmill, and I paid that sawmill off in a year. All of that really was because of the cabin. So if you've been watching my channel because of all the sawmilling, well, the truth of the matter is, it was so I could build an off-grid cabin. It wasn't because I was going to be a sawyer for the rest of my life. Well, I will, to some degree, but it wasn't so that I would run a business and do portable milling or even non-portable milling for many years to come. It was at one time a plan. I thought I'd retire and drive my camper and sawmill around and do portable sawmilling jobs. Unfortunately, my physical body doesn't agree with the brain, and there's just no way I could do it today. So, what are the challenges for building a cabin in the woods? Because that may be what you're interested in. So let's get to the challenges. First of all, distance. Obviously, if you're 4.5 hours away on a good day from home, that's quite a distance. And that means gasoline to get you there, or diesel. So I have to plan about $150 in fuel costs just to get to the cabin and back each time I go. So twice a month, that's $300 a month in fuel just to get to the cabin and back. So plan for fuel over those long distances. 2, well, there's no power. Where I built, I was 3 miles nearly from the nearest power line. Not going to have power. It would have cost tens of thousands of dollars to put in power. So when building, I had to have a generator. That means lugging a big generator that I don't know what it weighed, 80 pounds or something, up to the cabin each trip, or trying to lock it down up there, which I didn't like that idea. You got to have fuel for the generator. You're going to need a chainsaw fuel and all that kind of stuff. And when you're traveling all that distance and you have no power, if you run out of fuel, well, then you're back to no power if the generator's not running. So those are things that have to go through your mind. Plus, you either run a compressor with an air nailer, which I did do, or you got to nail everything by hand. So those are things you have to consider. When you have no power, you're either going to do it all by hand, and that's going to take longer, or if you want to build a stick frame cabin like I did, well, you need power to run your miter saws and all that kind of stuff. On top of all of that, I was 23 miles from the nearest hardware store. So if I went up there and I didn't have all the stuff that I needed, guess what? I was going to lose at least an hour to go get it. And losing an hour when, you drive out on a Friday evening, you get up Saturday morning, you work for a few hours, now you got to go to town. Well, you're going to lose a little bit of time, half an hour probably, getting ready to go. And if you leave the boys there, because I have boys with me, so I could leave them there, you're still taking off within 15, 20 minutes, half an hour. On the return, you got to unload, do whatever, get back started again. So you're going to really lose probably more like 2 hours. And if you planned on working 10 hours that day, you just lost 2. You're now down to 8. And if you're there for only a Saturday and Sunday, that means you may end up later on Sunday. So best laid plans of mice and men, it always ends up, at least it did for me, being over 20 miles from the nearest hardware store that I had to try to remember everything I needed for that specific day. And boy, if I forgot it, I wasn't a very happy camper because I was going to lose a couple hours. And losing a couple hours. And if you found out that you were losing a couple hours at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that's even worse. On top of all that, I had 2 teenage boys that I was teaching how to frame. And I hadn't swung a hammer in earnest in 15 years. They'd never swung a hammer at all in their life. And that was fun, and they learned, and it was great, but it's just something to think about. So distance, costs, fuel costs, having all the right tools, right? If you're going to frame a cabin, you need to have things like a miter saw. You could do it with a simple skill saw, but that's going to slow you down. You need some sort of bench to work off of. You could make one, but the bottom line is you're limited. So for me, I had a table saw, I had a miter saw, I had a skill saw. I pretty much had everything I needed, plus at least one chainsaw. I've got 3, 4, 4.5 now. The half one's busted. Whole nother story. And if you're going to get a sawmill and mill for yourself, well, then you probably need to have a chainsaw that can fall trees and the knowledge to do so, and a means of getting those trees back to your sawmill. For me, in the beginning, it was pulling them with my Jeep, believe it or not, and milling them on the ground. And then later, I finally got a tractor with a set of forks so that I could pick the logs up and haul them to the mill. And even later after that, I got a grapple. But as you can see, 15 years, things change. You get better at what you're doing. The last thing I'd say that you really need to think about is time. I know there are guys that have built cabins out there in a matter of weeks. Now, those cabins, in all honesty, and no offense to those that do it, were subpar construction. I'm sorry, but it's true. If you build 2x4 walls, that means you get R13, maybe R15 insulated walls, and they're not that strong, versus building, for example, 2x6 walls, where you can get R19 or R21 insulation, and they're much stronger. So all that has to be considered, but what quality of cabin do you want? If you're building a log cabin, a stick frame cabin, a properly or reasonably properly stick framed, timber framed, etc., it's going to take you a while. And if you're only doing it on weekends, figure out that it's going to take you considerably longer than you think. If you think you could do it in a year, you might be wrong. It might be 3 years. And my buddy Tim has a rule. It's a rule of 3. Anything you think is going to take, say, an hour is really going to take you 3 hours. So I think that's probably right. I've seen it go 4. But, on a cabin, you think it's going to take you a year, you might want to plan for 3. In my case, I'm still at it 15 years later, but there are reasons for that. For example, I bought a sawmill that was big enough to go out and earn a living on, and then I did that instead of working on a cabin for a number of years, and that held back on my cabin build. And then by then, physically, I was faced with all kinds of challenges. So you might watch my YouTube channel and think, but you do this. Creative editing, folks. Not totally. I do those things, but I just don't do them every day. There's a difference between building a cabin 5 days a week and all month long, and doing it for a day and a half on the weekends, every other weekend. Big difference. Anyway, enough said there. Now, on the topic of money, it's really important to build a budget. I mentioned that we did $1,000 a month, but sometimes you have expenses that go above and beyond that. Perhaps, for example, you want a wood stove, and a wood stove back then was $1,000 for the one I bought, above and beyond the $1,000 a month. So that meant that Darci and I had to sit down and really look at the budget and see where we could come up with the money for that. And in all honesty, we did not want to use credit. We may buy it with a credit card, but then we would pay it off. Or we'd use an ATM card, basically, right? Checking card. So try not to finance anything if you can. Sometimes you're going to, but make that the priority to pay off. Now, for me, this project went on from 2009 until 2013, in the summer of 13. I worked from home, and that allowed me to break my schedule up. I worked on my own schedule, so I could do things like work really hard all week, get my 40 hours in by, say, Friday at noon, and then pack up the Jeep and trailer and haul butt up to the cabin. So that was very helpful. But in 2013, I was offered the job as a manager for that phone company. And of course, I jumped at it, in part because it was just an hour from my cabin. What that meant is that I could work on the cabin and work in close proximity. And that made a big difference for me. And it was a major turning point for my cabin project, in part because the company paid me to move to the cabin. And that allowed me to afford the cost of trenching over 600 feet of 2-inch conduit from my 300-gallon cistern down to the cabin, and putting in a new frost-free and a main line that went into the cabin that provided water directly inside the cabin, which we didn't have before. We had water inside the cabin, but it was fed off a 55-gallon drum. It also allowed me to buy my 6,000-watt Generac Eco generator and put in a 500-gallon propane tank, and go to a 24-volt system with a 4,000-watt pure sine wave inverter. So, and all the stuff that goes with that. So that was a major turning point for the cabin. So if you're building a cabin, and you want to fast forward things, well, an injection of a whole lot of money really, really helps. So it was a major turning point, but there were some setbacks as well. First, I told you, I'm a bit of a busted up jarhead. And there were times when I would go out to the cabin with big plans to do things, and my back would get in the way, and I just couldn't do it. And I would have to sit in the cabin and read all day long, and and take some Tylenol or something, and hope that whatever was troubling my back would ease up enough that I could get back to work. And many times it didn't. So physically, again, that whole be in shape thing, even though I was getting in better shape, by the time mid-2013 rolled around, I was down to 227 pounds. I'd lost 60 pounds in 6 months because I was walking all the time, every day, riding a mountain bike, eating better, all that good stuff. But I would still have back problems, shoulder problems. When I built the deck in front of the cabin, when I was done, I could hardly do anything for 6 months. And this is the challenge that I face. So if you're watching my channel and you look around and you think, well, Eric, you haven't finished the wall behind you, let alone the other two, well, unfortunately, I'm not physically able to all the time. So what you see when you see me working on things is you see the times when I can. And some of that time you may or may not notice, but I might be walking with a cane, or more recently, friends of mine are doing the more heavy lifting. And thank God for those great friends that I have. Fantastic people. But and maybe that's something else to consider. If you're trying to do this, especially if you've got some physical limitations like I do, I can't tell you the value of friends. It's immense. But that means that you need to be cognizant of that too. If your friends are helping you out, you probably need to do something like say, hey guys, here's access to my property so you can go camping whether I'm there or not. Have a nice day, right? That's something you could do. So there's just something to consider. If you're physically fit and you don't have medical physical challenges, you won't have that. You won't face that problem. But for me, it certainly is. And the other problem I had was I bought that big sawmill, which isn't really a problem, but it is in the cabin sense because I needed to pay for it. That was the commitment I made. I needed a bigger sawmill so I could do more, and I wanted one. And I thought, you know what? I'll just pay for it. Well, that meant that over the next 2 years, I didn't work on the cabin. I don't know that I did anything on the cabin from 2016 through 2018. And even in 2018, the amount of work I was doing was less and less. So as you get closer to finishing the cabin, if you take on something like a new job or a second job like I did with the sawmill, it's going to set you back. And then there's the job setbacks. So if you have a job and you're in management like I was, the whole world is doing this, folks. They start laying off managers. And at one point, I became the only guy in my area where there used to be several of us trying to manage about a third of the state. It was just too much. So I had to quit doing it. And that's something else to think about, right? If you're close to retirement age, you've got a disability, your job's killing you, is it worth continuing on with the job? But if you don't do the job, you won't have money to spend on the cabin. So you have this dichotomy. On one hand, I have a job that's killing me, but I've got the money I need to spend on the cabin. But on the other hand, I've got the job that's killing me and I don't have time to work on the cabin. So you hope that later you will, and then you're broken. So, these are real things to consider, things that I've had to work on. And I think at some point, you've got to come to the conclusion that you can't do it all. You can't do it all in a day, in a weekend, in a month, in a year, and you're going to get it done when you can. So for example, my latest project, I have, well, frankly, 3 of them, but my priorities are finish the back room. I need to get that back room. At the very least, I need to get the storm door put in. It's not done yet. I need to roof the outhouse, or I'll have to re-roof the whole thing. So I need to get roofing for the outhouse. And I really need to clean up the wiring and do the interior of the back room. That could survive another winter though, as long as I get the storm entrance done. Now I will tell you, I am super happy I did it. And I don't want to discourage anybody. You could be 65 years old today and thinking about building a cabin in the woods, and I would say go for it. Just be cognizant of the challenges you might face, and if you can get help, even better, but go for it. I can't tell you enough how awesome it is to have a cabin in the woods that I get to go to whenever I can or want to, and spend time out there checking the game cameras, wandering around the property, doing a little shooting, maybe go fishing in a lake nearby, hanging out on the deck and just watching the deer go by. It's a beautiful thing. It's something that is probably one of the most amazing things I've had in my life, besides marrying Darci and having my kids and all that kind of stuff. But go for it. Build that cabin. But go into it with both eyes open. Know that it's not a good idea to finance it if you can help it. Try to build it as close to home as you can within reason, but have it tucked away enough that you're out in the middle of nowhere when you're there and you don't have a lot of neighbors bugging you or people driving by on a main road checking it out, right? Those are things to consider, and give yourself the time. Enjoy. So do me a favor, comment about your thoughts about cabin building and being off the grid and all that kind of stuff. Let me know what you think, and do me a favor, if you enjoy this kind of content, let me know in the bottom, and hit that subscribe button and even that notification bell, because the next video, when it comes out, you'll know all about it. Thanks for watching, folks. Y'all have a great day. The old Jarhead out.